people are shocked to their core, because some people actually believe the propaganda that the EU stood for democracy, human rights, values and so on. And it's so blatant as we see the first live stream genocide on TV that now that's not the case.
And the support for Israel is European support and American support and UK support for a settler colonial project that they started and they still haven't finished it. And if you think that they have a problem with Gaza being ethnically cleansed of Palestinians, well, think again, because they have been silent and watched. They talked so much about a two-state solution, but in actual fact, they have watched it over it being absolutely made impossible. And we say now that we want one state with equal rights for all and human rights for all, and the return of all Palestinian refugees.
Hello, everyone. I'm Rania Khalek, and this is Dispatches. After nearly 4 months of Israeli genocide in Gaza, the Europeans have suspended funding to UNRWA, literally cutting humanitarian assistance to the Palestinian people as they're dodging nonstop Israeli bombs and dying of hunger and disease. A people whom the International Court of Justice just ruled are plausibly being genocided. Why does Europe support Israel so much? What does Europe gain from the occupation of Palestine and further escalation across the Middle East? How much of this is Europe following its own interests versus being subservient to US imperial designs in the region, as we've seen with Ukraine? Is Europe actually united on this? Or are there segments of the body politic that disagree with the US and Israel's imperialist aims in Gaza? Does the EU have any awareness of its own hypocrisy? And are there consequences for those who speak out against the status quo? Joining me to discuss this and more are two members of the European Parliament, Clare Daly and Mick Wallace. But before we jump into it, this is just part of this episode. The full interview is available to Breakthrough News members only. You can become a member at patreon.com/breakthrough news. And as always, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the bell so you get a notification whenever we post new content. And if you appreciate this show, you can also donate below on YouTube. Clare and Mick, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Rania. Nice to talk to you again.
It's really a pleasure to have you on. You all have been speaking on Gaza consistently and really on most everything having to do with war, some of the only voices coming out of the European Parliament. So I want to thank you for that. And I guess, a good place to start would be some of the more recent developments around what's taking place with Israel's genocide in Gaza. And that is, as I'm sure you're aware, because you're a part of it, the EU Parliament has called a few days ago for a ceasefire, but of course also had some conditions attached, demanding Hamas be dismantled and hostages be released. The Hamas being dismantled part is, of course, a bit of a contradiction, but it does seem as though this demonstrates, perhaps, and you can disagree with me or tell me if I'm wrong, but that Europe has maybe softened its stance a little bit after almost 4 months of this genocide. So I'm just curious, can you tell me what's happening when it comes to the European Parliament as it relates to Israel's genocide in Gaza?
Okay, look, at that motion was really disappointing from our point of view. In actual fact, what it was a call not for a ceasefire at all. It was a call for the Israeli terms, which was, as you said, dismantlement of Hamas, which effectively means a green light to continue the genocide. And it wasn't just us saying that. Once the parliament took that position, Israeli officials were tweeting with glee how the European Union were on their side. And I mean, the motion itself was full of so many awful parts to it. I mean, it didn't criticize, it called for sanctions on Iran, but not on Israel. It wouldn't call for it voted against breaking the EU-Israel association agreement. It voted down a call for an arms embargo. It voted down a call that the outcome of the ICJ would be respected. So in other words, the European Parliament ignores international law. I mean, it was a litany of appalling stuff in that. But I mean, you're right, the dialogue around it at the time, because previously we'd had a motion just after October 7th. and they wouldn't use the term ceasefire. They wanted a humanitarian pause. So they tried to make a big deal that this was a shift to a ceasefire, but actually it was a ceasefire on Netanyahu's terms and seized upon by the Israelis as such. So for us, they were greenlighting genocide again, just as the EU has been doing from the start, and in complete opposition to the millions of Europeans who've been on the streets week in, week out since this started.
Mick, is there anything you want to add on that?
Yeah, I mean, the people of Europe are very conscious of the fact that the European Union has supported the genocide in Gaza from the start. The two presidents, von der Leyen and Metsola, they went to Tel Aviv to tell Israel that they could do whatever they liked, and that they were prepared to pretend that the history of the problems between Israel and Gaza started on the 7th of October and not in 1948. And we even had a vigil outside the Parliament, which looked to a vigil to honour the dead that had died from the Hamas attack in Israel, but refused to mention the numbers that had already been killed, which was a greater number already by the time the vigil took place of the Palestinians killed in Gaza. So there was no mention of the Palestinians killed, and we wrote to the president demanding, surely you can't do this. This is too bad, and the response was, this is not the time for whataboutism. So I mean, now you must also remember that the Israeli flags flew on the European Parliament buildings, the European Council and Commission buildings had Israeli flags up, and if you had a Palestinian flag outside of the Parliament, it was likely to be confiscated if the security people had got to you in time. So Israel has definitely had the backing of the European Union from get-go, and unfortunately it still has it. You talked about a change of position, a bit of a rollback, and there's been a little bit from some of the MEPs who are getting lashed out of it in their own countries by the public, because well over 90% of the people of Europe are completely horrified by what Israel is doing in Gaza. So whereas you have the politicians on a different page, but we've seen this before, and the sad truth about it is that the politicians do not represent the people of Europe, and that's the truth.
You know, and it is interesting when you think about that, because, you know, you have Ursula von der Leyen, who has been, I think, you know, probably one of the most vocal supporters of this horror show in Gaza since the beginning. She even visited wearing that bulletproof vest at the border with Gaza as Israel began its carpet bombing campaign. She's repeatedly called it Israel's right to defend itself. And I mean, you know, nobody elected her. Elected her. She kind of just follows, and you go, you know, it's something similar that we've seen with how she behaves around the issue of Ukraine. You also have, you know, I call him Joseph Borrell is, you know, the one who talked about the garden in the jungle, referring to the global north and the global south. I mean, just blatant racism. I believe he's the foreign minister of the European Union. Also, at the beginning, super supportive. And these people claim to be representing civilization and international law and caring about human rights. But, you know, after what they've supported in Gaza, I guess I'd want you to address two things. One, these people weren't elected by anybody. So it does seem as though this is an incredibly anti-democratic institution when these people get to speak on behalf of Europe. But then the other question I would have related to that is, you know, when we talk about Israel and supporting it, what does Europe get out of it? What do Ursula von der Leyen and Joseph Borrell get out of supporting this, you know, genocidal apartheid state when so much of their population that they supposedly represent is against it?
Yeah, I mean, we could be here absolutely all night answering that one. I suppose the first thing to say is we've christened Ursula von der Leyen Frau Genocide, and it's actually taken on. It has served their role in this situation has meant that the blinkers are off for people all over Europe now, see the EU and certainly in Ireland for what it is now. People are shocked to their core because some people actually believe the propaganda that the EU stood for democracy, human rights, values and so on. And it's so blatant as we see the first live stream genocide on TV that now that's not the case, that it's actually been profoundly shocking for a lot of people in Europe who feel they've kind of lost their moral compass on the issue. I think von der Leyen has been particularly bad. I mean, you should remember that her words were used by the Israelis in their defence of the charge of genocide in South Africa's case before in The Hague. Shocking that the European Commission's president's words were used to justify genocide. That's how bad she's gone into the camp. But you're totally right. She's no legal, not to mind moral authority to do that in the structure. She's just really a civil servant, appointed and unelected by nobody. I mean, we nominally elect the president, but it's a pool. You either approve them or don't, and it comes from a little pot. Borrell actually does have the right to speak on behalf of the EU in terms of foreign policy because he's the foreign minister and he is supposed to articulate the views of the 27 member states, which has been a lot more nuanced even from the beginning than von der Leyen's position. So legally, and he has been quite critical of her, he has come out and said things like that Israel has funded Hamas, for example, and he has been a lot more moderate than she has, and legally he's the only one to speak for the EU. So it's a sort of a confused position. I think von der Leyen and her commission are particularly weak. A lot of the governments of Europe are particularly weak, and like in Ukraine, now with support in Israel, they seem to just exist to back whatever the US tell them to back. And you say, what's in it for them? Well, absolutely nothing, because their sanctions against Russia, for example, to cripple Russia, have just resulted in Russia being the biggest economy in Europe and the German economy going to smithereens. So it's a shooting in the foot tactic, really, but it's to serve US interests. I don't know what they're getting out of it, but nobody in Europe is getting anything out of it, that's for sure.
Yeah, there's also an element of, aside from, talking about the representation and how much the politicians represent the people of Europe, we had a very similar story with Ukraine, where about 80% of the people of Europe were in favour of peace rather than continuing to punish Russia. A result that came from a European Foreign Relations Council survey. It was over 70% first, and it actually increased over the next couple of months, and that was held in June 2022. But Clare and myself, we put in an amendment twice to the resolution on Ukraine last year, and on our resolution called on the EU to maximise its potential to commence dialogue and diplomacy with a view to ending the war and bringing about peace. So while we had 80% of the people of Europe wanting peace, over 80% of the MEPs voted against that resolution. In other words, they voted for the war to continue. Now, these people weren't fighting in the war and they weren't sending their kids over to fight in it. But we know now that over 300,000 working class Ukrainians have died on it. And it's pretty obvious that we don't really give a damn about them. But asking what's in it for us supporting an Israeli genocide, well, the truth is that this settler colonial project, of which is the makeup of Zionism, this was begun by Europeans. And this started back in 47, 48. It is a European invention. And sadly, we haven't abandoned colonialism. If you look at EU activity in Africa, and we talk a lot about Africa in here, you'll see that, whether you call it neocolonialism or colonialism, it hasn't really gone away. And the support for Israel is European support and American support and UK support for a settler colonial project that they started and they still haven't finished it. And if you think that they have a problem with Gaza being ethnically cleansed of Palestinians, well, think again, because they have been silent and watched. They talked so much about a two-state solution, but in actual fact, they have watched it over it being absolutely made impossible. And we say now that we want one state with equal rights for all and human rights for all, and the return of all Palestinian refugees. This idea of a two-state solution is dead thanks to the support of the Americans and the Europeans for the illegal occupation and the settlements. So we are part of the settler colonial project that is Zionism.
Yeah, that's very well said. And, I wanted to zoom out just a little bit from just Palestine, because, you also have this broader escalation across the region, where you now have the United States bombing Yemen to prevent the Yemenis, or to try to deter, they say, the Yemenis from blocking ships destined for Israel in the Red Sea. You have this potential escalation that continues to go, kind of tit for tat at the border between Lebanon with the Israelis, and Israel is really kind of watering at the mouth. The Israelis are watering at the mouth to launch a war on Lebanon. And so far, the U.S. has kind of tried to restrain them a bit for now, but it's unclear if that's going to continue. You have these groups across Iraq and Syria that, in solidarity with the people of Gaza, are firing at the American presence in both Iraq and Syria. And I mean, yesterday there was, for the first time, the death of, as we're recording this, the first time 3 American service personnel were killed. But that was completely predictable. I mean, and completely preventable, because across the region, you have these various armed groups saying repeatedly, stop the genocide in Gaza and we will hold our fire. And rather than stop the genocide in Gaza, it's pretty incredible. You see the Biden administration just willing to basically sacrifice Americans at this point, so Israel can continue its genocide in Gaza. And I noticed in a video, Claire, you specifically called him Butcher Biden, which I thought was a very fitting name. But all that's to say, again, you talk about, Europe, and this is not in Europe's interest, except for, of course, what you mentioned, the whole settler colonial project that was started by Europe. But, when it comes to these broader wars across the Middle East, it is in fact Europe that has to deal with consequences more directly than the United States. The United States has the Atlantic Ocean. Typically, people who are forced to become refugees go to Europe because it's closer by land. Obviously, you don't have to deal with that so much in the U.S., at least not from the Middle East. And that ends up, Europe has to deal with that economically. It also ends up changing the politics of Europe. All that's to say, are you concerned about this broader escalation across the region should this genocide continue? And is there a conversation inside the European Parliament about what Europe's role should be? And I mean, I would hope trying to prevent that, or do people just not care?
Yeah, I mean, you've touched on so many issues there, and we would all be mindful that there is an inherent danger in the present situation that it could spiral. It would seem to me that the actions of Israel are certainly designed to provoke a situation which would force the US to enter the scene more, because the truth is that Israel is losing. It's tragic that it's coming at such an enormous cost to the Palestinians and the people of Gaza, but they've lost it. Like the Zionist project is over now. It has lost the moral authority amongst the majority of the world's people and significant sections of the Jewish population as well. So that's over. So this is desperation, and they'd like to escalate it, and that's incredibly worrying. And I suppose one of the people who benefit from that is the military-industrial complex, because it does come back to it is their interests also who are fueling a lot of this as well. And it's easy for them to have the battle carried out in the Middle East, where up to now there hasn't been any US or Europeans killed. But that could, of course, change in the future. But it's incredibly destabilising. So I think the EU tries to steer a path and does it quite badly. I mean, the affront of the way in which they responded to the illegal, unwarranted, appalling bombings of Yemen, completely outside the scope of international law, because they were appalled at the threat to shipping and the erosion of international law that meant when they watched the slaughter of innocents for months now, and they weren't affronted at the erosion of international law in that. So I think people in Europe can see that. So that discussion is going on, kind of, where the hell are we going with all of this stuff? And in some ways, EU politics are becoming a little bit more like US politics, where you've got two sides of the one coin, completely captured by the lobbyists and big corporate industry, where the citizens, there's a big gap in accountability. And something like that is being tried here, whereby you have this EU elite who are completely captured by big business, by the military-industrial complex, by all of those lobbyists in whose interests this madness is. And there's that gulf developing with the citizens. Now, they haven't quite got there yet, because actually the real power is still mainly with the 27 individual member state countries in terms of foreign affairs and that, but they're trying to all the time change that and put more and more power in the hands of the EU itself. So it's a power grab. Ursula von der Leyen reflects that side of the EU, but the people don't want to give that up. They don't want to move away from unanimity in votes, so they want to have a qualified majority voting where the big countries would rule. There's been a resistance to that. It would have meant for now, like countries like Ireland would have had to gone along with the sort of Frau Genocide line, which obviously people don't want to. So there's an awful lot of stuff going on there. The inflammation of the air of the region is one that we'd be worried about. They've tried to drag Iran into it. I don't think Iran will respond to that. They're too astute for that. But you never know. I mean...
Yeah, I think the episode in Yemen was a bit of an eye-opener as well for the Europeans. We had Yemen interfering with ships that were facilitating a genocide in Gaza. And under international law, I mean, states are actually supposed to do their utmost to prevent a genocide taking place. And the only two countries that have really done much in that area at the moment are South Africa and Yemen. And the two of them deserve great respect for their efforts in trying to bring the genocide to an end. But for the Americans and the British to start bombing cities in Yemen in response to them interfering with commercial shipping when nobody had been killed, and in contrast to almost 30,000 being killed in Gaza. So the Yemenis kill nobody and they get bombed. Israel kills almost 30,000 and they don't get bombed. I mean, the people are not stupid. And the people are waking up to this. Did the Americans want to distract a bit from the terrible atrocities taking place in Gaza by bombing Houthi and Ansar positions? I don't know. Do the Americans want to escalate it? I'm not so sure they do, and I would agree with you that they have been. They are a little bit wary now of Lebanon being dragged too much into it. That might be a bit more than they could taste. And I also don't think they need. I don't think they want a conflict with Iran at the moment. They're happy enough for Israel to bomb positions in Syria and whatever in response to so-called the Iranian staff involved in that kind of thing. They can't mention the Houthis without calling them the Iran-backed Houthis. Yeah. I think the Houthis now have earned the respect to be seen as an entity in their own making. And I don't think they're anyone's proxy. But I still don't think, despite the prompting of Israel, I think Netanyahu wants it escalated to save his own skin. And if it goes wider, I think the status quo isn't good enough for him. I think an escalation he thinks would suit him. I'm still not convinced that the Americans want to escalate it.
Yeah, no one else is really biting, and the Europeans weren't. I think that's important in Yemen. They didn't really get actively involved. They're worried about the consequences for the ceasefire there. They don't really want it unraveling, even though they haven't sort of slapped the US or UK on the wrist.
Yeah, that does seem to be the case. I also wanted to ask, you've sort of alluded to this a little bit, but I'd love for you to elaborate a bit, both of you, on the fact that obviously the EU itself is not entirely united in the sense that you have certain countries like Germany, for example, where Ursula von der Leyen comes from, which is 100%, willing to support whatever Israel does, no constraints. I mean, sometimes I'm sort of shocked at the rhetoric that comes out of Germany's political establishment. It makes, I'm like, are you the Likud government suddenly? It's very strange. But you have the Germans being very, very hawkish, as well as some of the other wealthier, big, countries that control more of what happens across Europe. And then you have other countries which has been somewhat interesting, like Belgium and Ireland and Spain, having a bit of a different take. So I'm curious if you could kind of just break that down for our audience a bit, because is Europe entirely united here, or is there a split?
Well, I think there's probably a kind of a false understanding in America of what the European Union is. And we're not a United States of Europe, right? We're a grouping of 27 member states. And a lot of the competencies are in the running of a country are left with the member state rather than dictated by the central authority in Brussels and Strasbourg. So now there is moves afoot in the last number of years to centralise the power more and give more power to the Commission in particular. And von der Leyen has obviously been a strong advocate of that. And linked to that is what we have been watching now for a number of years, and they're looking to try and bring it together more, and that is the militarization of Europe. And that's very much part of this project to get the 27 members on the same page. But that's a huge challenge. I mean, people need to understand, for example, that the countries in Eastern Europe, which were brought in mostly in 2004 into the European Union, kind of brought in a bit quickly. Two main reasons. They wanted to get them into NATO, and they also wanted our cheap pool of labour to do the dirty work in Western Europe, where the economies were more developed. But the people in that Eastern European section, they think very different, and that's normal, right? They're different cultures, and they think very different to some of the more strong Western European countries. So the idea that one of these days we're all going to think the same, that's a bit of a stretch now. And that there has been different attitudes to the war. Right now, there's moves afoot to put some manners on Hungary because they're not signing off on the latest 50 billion Ukraine facility money, which is supposed to go to Ukraine over the next 4 years, partly around reconstruction, partly around just keeping the place running. We're very keen to keep the show on the road there, despite the fact that it's turned into a horror show, and they say that up to 30,000 Ukrainians are dying per month at the moment, but that's not really bothering us too much at European level. We don't seem to really care about them. But countries have a different approach to things like Gaza as well. And Spain, for example, as you mentioned, have been one of the better ones, and Germany have been one of the worst ones. Now, Germany and Spain could agree strongly on something else. The Germans, I mean, to be honest, were a bit horrified at the positions they've taken on the Ukraine war. The Greens in Germany have been the biggest cheerleaders for NATO and pumping the money and weapons into Ukraine to make sure to keep the war going, a war that does not benefit the people of Europe or the people of Ukraine. The German Greens have been horrific, but most of the German state have been pro-war. And now, I mean, it beggars belief that they can take this position on Gaza. And we pointed out to them in Strasbourg last week that the first genocide of the 20th century was in Namibia, caused by Germany. We had the Second World War and the Holocaust. And now we have Germany, the cheerleaders for another genocide in Gaza. I mean, it beggars belief. And I don't accept that this is the page that the European people are on. The German politicians are certainly on it. I'm not so sure that the European people are on the same page.
That's a really mixed point about the militarisation of Europe is a really strong one. And I think they thought they had that unity around Ukraine, which was kind of bullied in everybody onto the one page. And that arm of the EU sort of got a boost out of that. It's been completely different on Gaza. And I think countries like Belgium, which has a very large Palestinian population, countries like Ireland, which was occupied and oppressed itself. I mean, you can't really accuse someone in Ireland who gives out about Israel of being anti-Semitic the way you'd get away with that in Britain. It doesn't wash in Ireland. People know the difference. So actually countries like Slovenia and that as well have been very, very good. But Mick's point is true. I mean, when we talk about Europe, what are we talking about? Because people in countries all over Europe are protesting, and it's utterly shocking. I mean, there's a kind of a left-wing-ish government in Spain. That's partly the reason why they're a bit better. But in Germany, even the German left have been pretty appalling on this issue. So it's not that straightforward.
Well, I do appreciate that mentioning of Ireland. I mean, Ireland's always had one of the best positions on Palestine, I think, for very obvious reasons. One thing that did also happen recently that I wanted to ask you about was this cutting of funding for UNRWA, the UN agency for Palestinian refugees. And it's quite shocking. I mean, this is all a manufactured smear campaign by the Israelis to say that UNRWA is somehow connected to Hamas. And the Europeans just announced that they'll be suspending funding to investigate these claims. I'm not sure how much of UNRWA funding is getting even into Gaza right now, but I mean, to cut that sort of thing, that humanitarian assistance essentially at a time when people are dodging bombs and just trying to survive every day. I mean, trying to find water and food if they can. I mean, it's horrifying. It's hard to even state into words the kind of atrocities and horrors people are living every day in Gaza. But I'm just curious your thoughts on the fact that this suspension of funding was just announced.
Well, that will certainly go down poorly with the people in Europe. It beggars belief that a politician can actually sit down and say, they're saying that a handful, 12 people or something, may have misbehaved and may have been involved in the Hamas attack out of a massive organisation. To say, we're cutting off your funding because of these people and we want it investigated. I mean, you're actually saying that you're prepared to starve people to death. That's it. You're starving people to death by cutting the UNRWA funding at the moment, because everything else, the Israelis have already cut off everything else. And the only way any assistance is getting in is through UNRWA. So if you cut them, well, you're saying, okay, we're going to starve you. And it's as simple as that.
It's another example, I think, of how we are not the United States of Europe, and nor are we supposed to be. I mean, in actual fact, what's happened here is this is in direct violation of what the ICJ ordered just a couple of days. Now, I've no doubt whatsoever that the announcement of, these people were in Hamas was absolutely planned by the Israelis deliberately to time with the possibility or the prospect of the ICJ ruling with South Africa. And then we come up with this nonsense story, which, as I'm led to believe, that the UNRWA runs the payroll for all of the civil service in the whole of Gaza. So the numbers that you have it's actually the whole of the public service that runs Gaza is funded off this, because that's the way it's funded. So you're dealing with a huge array of people. And in any case, it is not a justification for suspending the funding. This will mean that people will die. People who are already eating animal feed, digging around for water. It's just appalling. It's murdering people. I've no question. And it makes any country which has cut off the aid based on this complicit in genocide and complicit in breaking the ruling of the ICJ, as far as I'm concerned. And I think what we've had is a number of European countries have suspended the funding. Ireland hasn't, and most haven't, but Italy has, Germany has, I think Finland. And the Commission met at the moment, the position is they're considering what to do as an overall EU entity, but that would be appalling to do that, is being complicity in genocide as far as I'm concerned.
But at the root of this too, though, is European racism has been badly exposed. We said we really cared about Ukraine. Ukraine was being invaded by a big bad wolf, and Russia was obviously completely wrong to invade. It was a breach of the UN Charter, and it's while we're not too interested in the rules-based international order that Western powers make up as to go along, we do stand by the UN Charter, which mightn't be the best, mightn't be everything, but it's the best we've got at the moment. We said with the Ukrainians, this is terrible, there's Ukrainians being killed, oh my God. After 18 months, according to the UN, there was 565 children killed in Ukraine, a terrible figure. And we've 12,000 children killed in Gaza, and we're actually okay with the war to keep going. I mean, the truth of the matter is the Ukrainians are white and Christian, and it suited our geopolitical interest to come to so-called our rescue, but in actual fact we're helping to destroy the place. But the truth is we don't give a damn about the Palestinians because we're racist.
You know, I'm curious. My family's Lebanese. I grew up in the United States, and I've watched most of my life since I can remember Israel bomb people I'm related to. And so I'm used to that, right? despite knowing what Israel is capable of, knowing that they kill civilians, that's just how they do war, and really viciously. I'm really blown away by how far this has gone in Gaza and just the level of destruction and almost like it's almost like egomaniacal laughter, like Israelis like filming themselves while they do it. The sort of like fascistic sentiment that you see in Israeli society as they like gleefully massacre Palestinians in Gaza has really shocked me to my core. And I'm just curious, you all have been very vocal on this issue. You've been quite, ardently anti-imperialist on most issues of war. You've seen the viciousness and aggressiveness that comes with war when it comes, from the US or Europe or the Israelis. Are you shocked by how far this has gone for almost 4 months into this genocide?
Well, I never thought I'd see anything like this. I'm 40 years a political activist.
If you enjoyed this episode and want to hear the rest, you can access it by becoming a Breakthrough News member at patreon.com/breakthrough news.